It's time to enhance the relationship between expertise and impact, between knowledge and application. Welcome to a journey of discovery and empowerment. Welcome to All Physicians Lead, the Forbes Books podcast that highlights the critical leadership role that all practicing physicians take on every day. Here's Dr. Leon Morse.
My guest this week is Dr. James Stoller. Dr. Stoller is a true leader in the fields of medicine, education, and organizational development. As chair of the Education Institute at the Cleveland Clinic, he spearheads impactful initiatives to shape the future of medical education and physician leadership. Beyond his clinical and academic contributions, Dr. Stoller lends his expertise to enhance organizational behavior and collaborative leadership. Jamie, welcome to the podcast. Can we start things off by talking about how you got your start in medicine?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a lung doctor, a pulmonary critical care doctor. I think you have good awareness of that. You're married to one.
I do indeed.
A close colleague of mine. I think my calling to medicine was early in life, probably like many of your listeners who are physicians. Always had a proclivity for science and was dissecting frogs as a little guy, as you can imagine. And interestingly, early in my career, had a little bit of a pathway sort of divergence. Went to college, was an English major actually, and had aspired actually to be an English professor in my early college days. Came to be that one had to write a thesis in college, and I was interested in 16th century English literature, Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene and so on, and realized that I didn't have the personality to write a thesis on 16th century English literature, so then declared a double major in biochemistry and then went off to do a thesis in biochemistry and lockstep ever since. So I think it's a deep-seated calling at the end of the day. I also realized I'm a fairly gregarious person, and the life of an English academic interested in sort of esoteric literature would not satisfy my interpersonal appetites. So that was the career in medicine. And it was lockstep ever since then.
That's awesome. So many of us have these little inflection points in our careers that change things dramatically, but went in a very, very good direction overall. And I grew up in Meriden, Connecticut. I don't know if I've ever shared that with you. So I was just a hop, skip, and a jump from New Haven and Yale. Tell us a little bit about that experience and what's your favorite New Haven pizzeria?
Oh my goodness, you've asked the key question, Leon. Huge issue. And I have a story actually about pizza in New Haven. I lived there, of course, both for medical school 4 years and then came back for 2 of the 4 years of my fellowship training where I was a Robert Wood Johnson clinical scholar. I'd fallen under the spell of one of my mentors as a medical student, Professor Alvin Feinstein, who is really largely credited as being the author of clinical epidemiology. He and David Sackett at McMaster, their presence is still in the field. The folks at McMaster, Gordon Guyat and others are direct descendants of David Sackett, and Alvin Feinstein, through his Robert Johnson presence, has spawned a whole community of educational and epidemiologic leaders in the United States. So I had done my thesis with Alvin and again fell up under his spell in that regard. That was the prompt for my returning to New Haven after my internal medicine residency in Boston and my first year of pulmonary critical care training, also at the Brigham. I then left the Brigham, came back to New Haven to do those 2 years with Alvin, conjoined with pulmonary critical care training before going back to Boston. Anyway, your question is my experience with New Haven and pizza. So when I was a fellow on our return visit, we weren't making very much money. My wife was getting an MPH at Yale, and I sort of grew up under my father's influence of not doing debt. So we were committed to paying her tuition full freight in real time. That deficit between what I was making and what we were paying in tuition caused us to be fairly lean. So I was moonlighting a lot. This is a pizza story. So I was moonlighting one night in a hospital north of New Haven called Wallingford, a hospital called Gaylord, which is a rehab hospital. And I'm called to see a young woman, maybe 30 years old, who'd actually been a nurse, who had a barianeurysm and a stroke and now a fever. And I worked her up. Her dad happened to be in the room, and I work her up, and I say, I'll come back and check on you later after doing the workup. And the dad says to me, Doc, he says, you like pizza? I said, I love pizza. And as you know, New Haven is the epicenter for great pizza in the universe. Top-ranked pizza places, Pepe's and Sally's, are always present in New Haven. Well, it turns out, he said, Doc, you like pizza? You call this number. And he wrote down on a piece of paper, Sally Consiglio, with a telephone number. And it was Sally Consiglio of Sally's that I was actually seeing. And in fact, as you probably know, on a Saturday night in New Haven, one would never go to Worcester Square, which is where these pizza places are, for pizza, because it's so crowded, you'd wait for 2 hours. But I had this number, and I said to my wife, Terry, I don't know if it'll work, but why don't we try it? And sure enough, we called the number, and it's like a speakeasy. You get whisked in through the side door, and that's probably why the line is as long as it is, because there are all these people with the private number. But it was fabulous. There's one other coda to the story I'll just tell. 25 years later, our son was actually ultimately did go to Yale, and we went there on a visit, right? It was a Wednesday night. We said, well, let's go to Sally's Pizza. Up Pizza, as you know, it's Sally's Up Pizza in New Haven. And sure enough, we're sitting there. The decor is just the same as it was. And who comes to wait on us but now a 55 or so year old woman with a slight hemiparesis, which was in fact Sally's daughter. It was one of those episodes in life where your life spun around in front of you, because when I had first met her, our son was not a twinkle in our eye. And so this was quite the epiphany. So that's my New Haven pizza story.
That's awesome. I can't think of New Haven without thinking of pizza. And so when I was going to ask this question, I said, well, let's see if he takes the bait, if there's anything to this. You never know how the stories are going to come out, but that's really terrific, particularly mixing it in with medicine and the ability to care for somebody like that and then meeting her years later. So pulmonary critical care, obviously, as you said, I'm fairly familiar with the field vicariously. Why did you end up there? What sparked that interest?
Well, I'm sure each of us, in our disciplines has stories about influences on us. And for me, it was a sort of a combination of interest in the disease states and the physiology and the technical dimensions of it, bronchoscopy, et cetera. But perhaps more importantly than anything else, it was running into people who you admired, who you wanted to be like. And for me, there were many such people, but one that really stands out was, again, one of my mentors from my experience in New Haven as a medical student and then as a fellow, Richard Mathey. Richard is still thriving and has really prided himself as a generation of Yale medical students and Yale trainees that think of Richard as a mentor. I always admired, his clinical prowess and his commitment to scholarship. Funnily enough, Richard has played a role in my life as a continuing mentor. I think paradoxically, I came to Cleveland Clinic because Richard called me up when I was finishing my fellowship in Boston, having gone back to Boston from New Haven for another year of critical care at the MGH. And I get a call from Richard saying, Jamie, you should look at this job at the Cleveland Clinic. And as a kid who grew up in New York and was educated on the East Coast, Cleveland was not at all on my radar, I can tell you. But this call from Richard, who knew me extremely well and framed it attractively. And so I went out and looked, and long story short, here I am 37 years later. So I owe a lot to Richard, and his mentorship went beyond just influencing my interest in pulmonary critical care, but in being a good person and making career choices. I think we all have mentorship stories like that. And frankly, I've taken that commitment to pay forward in my own way. I'm sure you have as well. And all of us do. I'm in a unique position in my institution to mentor young, bright people. And I often think of Richard as the sort of North Star in my own framing of that role as I engage with other physicians whose careers are evolving.
Yeah, that's terrific. The niche that you're famous for, among others, leadership development, role modeling, as you use the term. Early on at the Cleveland Clinic, what types of things caused you to move in that direction, clearly that's part of who you are, but then you have to have opportunities at work to do that. As we know in clinical medicine, you're really a product of the clinical material, the patients that you see, regardless of what you want to do. How did the Cleveland Clinic mesh with that idea, those interests of yours, and move you down the leadership development pathway?
Well, thanks for the question. I would regard myself, Leon, as an accidental leader in the sense that I came to the clinic with a very clear-minded mission of being an academic pulmonary critical care doctor. And I was fortunate early in my career to have a number of opportunities and to develop interests and expertise in certain areas. COPD, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. It's sort of a boutique-ish practice, but I actually follow literally hundreds of patients with alpha-1 over my career here. Having said that, my entree into leadership development and my awareness of it, because I never had the intention of coming here to serve in the role that I currently serve in, which is chairman of our education institute, not on my radar at all. What happened, and I believe happens to many doctors who are in sort of particularly in academic tracks, is that I came with a set of sort of academic punch list, if you will. I needed to do X, Y, Z, publish in this journal, get this grant, achieve this academic stature, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm by no means suggesting that I've checked off every box that there is, but about 15 or 18 years into my career here, sort of paradoxically experienced what I came to call fear ennui, a certain, not burned out by any means. I've thankfully never been burned out, although it's a prevalent phenomenon, but a certain deflation of energy around my work. And I'm the least likely guy I know who would be subject to that. I'm a sort of all cylinders all the time sort of person. That really caught me off guard, Leon. And so being the academic nerd I am, having experienced that, I then embarked on a journey to understand that phenomenon. How could you experience a deflation of energy around your work? And in talking to many colleagues who were at similar points in their career, I came to learn that this was not unique to me. In fact, it was quite broadly shared. Subsequent discussions have further validated that impression. Long story short, in my attempt to understand this, I was referred to a professor of organizational development at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And I remember going over, making an appointment to go talk to Eric on someone's recommendation, and sat down with him, allocated about an hour to this meeting at the end of the day. And 3 hours later, we were actively engaged in this dialogue about career ennui and what it meant and how it occurs. And I garnered his insights that, in fact, my experience was not at all idiosyncratic, but was, in fact, predictable. That is to say that knowledge workers, whether lawyers, engineers, doctors, professors, all experience a cadence in their careers. And the cadence relates to achievement of mastery, with the idea that mastery occurs in about 7 to 10 year increments. I'm sure you as a neurosurgeon have experienced that, in year 2 of your professional career, you weren't as good as you were at year 10, right? And we're all getting better all the time. That's not to say that our learning curve ever shallows completely, but it does reach a shallowing, an asymptote of sorts. And with that occurrence, given that we're also challenge-driven and impact junkies, all of us want to have impact, that combination of achieving relative mastery along with this drive to make impact creates this restlessness, which is the genesis of career ennui. And coincidentally, Eric Nielsen, this professor, happened to be leading the master's program in organizational development at Weatherhead School of Management. And I was sufficiently intrigued by the conversation and curious about the field about which I literally knew nothing. I couldn't have told you what organizational development was at that point in my life. I said, okay, I'm curious. Being, again, the academic nerd that I am, and realizing that, our son then was in 4th grade, we had lots of competing demands, that the only way I was going to give this material the attention I thought it deserved was to be accountable for the learning and go to school. So I said, Eric, I'm going to apply to the master's program in organizational development with, honestly, Leon, no intention whatsoever that it would have an impact on my career or even the way I practice medicine. But I've come to realize quite the contrary. So spent 2 years studying leadership, studying change management, thinking deeply about organizations and the interface with individuals. And in the aftermath of that, on graduating from that program, was invited to serve as the Associate Chief of Staff at the Cleveland Clinic, invited to develop curricula, to develop leadership. This is now 20 years ago, and did so. And we ran our institution's commitment to developing leaders, much like the Uniformed Services University, in your own experience, and Lisa's and others. I've been fortunate enough to be a visiting professor there and saw it up close and personal. And then the only other sort of serendipitous event, because our lives are full of serendipity. I love the Louis Pasteur quote that chance favors the prepared mind. And I was deeply into developing curricula on leadership and teaching these courses when my predecessor in my current role, a fellow named Dr. Andy Fischleder, was tapped to go to Abu Dhabi as the CEO of our then new hospital in Abu Dhabi, Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi, and that created a vacancy in the role chairman of the Education Institute. And I realized that I'd been teaching and studying leadership. Honestly, I really wasn't interested in more traditional leadership roles like chair of pulmonary critical care, even chairs of medicine. I didn't really look at those jobs when I was invited to do so, but I was very interested in education because that's always been sort of core to who I am. So the opportunity to serve in that role was highly appealing, and I was lucky enough to be asked to serve in that role and still do. So there's a lot of serendipity in this story about how I came to be interested in leadership and leadership development, but it's become, in some ways, the highlight of an otherwise very satisfying career, and clearly the contribution that I'm interested in making at this point in my life, as well as my life as a doctor, of course, and as an academic interested in COPD and alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So I've been the beneficiary of a very satisfying career, making contributions that are the ones that appeal to my core values. Let's put it that way.
And I'm quite certain that when all those chances were placed in front of you, your mind was never unprepared. So you're always in a good position to pursue those. Congratulations on that. One of the things that you mentioned a few minutes ago is the idea of getting individuals into some sort of program where they think about, work on, develop their leadership talents. One of the things that I'm convinced about is that, organizations don't have culture. Organizations have people. People have behaviors. Behaviors create culture. You can drill everything down to individual interactions. When I was a lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division, as a platoon leader standing in front of 40 soldiers, that was really 40 one-on-one interactions. There's not this homogeneous blob of a brain that reacts one way. Those are 40 individual interactions every time you speak as a leader. So when you're looking at an education institute like that, how does that play out? You have folks coming in with very different backgrounds, very different perspectives, different potentially experiences in their leadership journey. How do you baseline folks? What's the needs assessment? How do you then take folks who are advanced learners versus beginning learners in this genre and move them forward through that? What's the process?
Well, that's a very thoughtful question, Leon. When people unpack how you develop leaders, there are really three elements. And this is work that comes from the Center for Creative Leadership in North Carolina. 10%, it said, is curriculum. So having a vocabulary of leadership competencies, change management, situational leadership, emotional intelligence, et cetera. 20% is coaching and mentoring, having supportive mentors and coaches that are like Richard Bathey and others in my career, and I'm sure you've experienced the same in yours. People that are in support of your growth. Gordon Snyder was another amazing mentor for me. And then 70% is experiential leadership. That is to say, being put in roles of leadership and being held to account for success, and then leveraging that success for greater and greater roles as a leader. And that culture of curriculum, mentorship, and experiential leadership is very much in evidence at my institution, as I'm sure in most. The curriculum is a minor component, but an important component, because I've often thought and teach that the competencies on which doctors are trained in the hidden curriculum of training, which is much better now than when I trained, but is still in evidence today, is actually antithetical to leadership competencies. Doctors are still trained as heroic lone healers, as gladiators, right? The captain of the ship in the operating room. The metaphors that are used are all about sort of individualistic behavior. And yet we understand very well that we succeed as teams, not as individuals, particularly in the complex world of medicine today, neurosurgery in your case, and critical care medicine, or pulmonary medicine in my case. And so we have to sort of unfreeze those behaviors for doctors and demonstrate to them the impact of these new competencies to be leaders. You know, we often say that ascending to leadership roles is a function of two things. One is threshold competencies, that is to say, commanding the respect of your colleagues in your discipline. One has to be credible pulmonary critical care doctor, a credible neurosurgeon, both clinically and academically, to be asked to serve in leadership roles at this institution, as I'm sure at most. But having the biggest CV and the most R01s and the most extramural funding is not the criterion for selection for leadership. Your clinical and academic credibility gets you to be considered a threshold, but what differentiates leaders and what causes them to be selected and maintained in the role is, in fact, their leadership competencies, which are different. So again, three things: curriculum, mentorship, coaching, and experiential leadership. And the way that the needs assessment is individualized is that people come to their aspirations for leadership with very different baseline levels of awareness. Some people have a whole curriculum background in leadership. Others are new to it. And we have a whole large number of learning communities at my institution, not only in graduate medical education, but in the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine, medical school, in health professions education, in nursing education, et cetera. And in each of these instances where we're meeting people where they are and trying to satisfy their needs, both to learn their clinical disciplines and their scientific disciplines, as well as to learn their leadership curricula. It's not for everyone. As I said, I didn't come here with an aspiration to lead. It was an accidental, serendipitous event, but it's become a major source of professional satisfaction for me. And we are all trying to recruit and preserve talent in our organizations. And so strategically, leadership development becomes a retention and recruitment strategy as well. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great. That reminds me of the Nobel laureate, where the university professor was asking how much time would you need to present your work at our institution, and paraphrasing a bit, but he said, well, how much time do you have? And the president was like, well, what do you mean? He says, well, if you want me to give a 1-hour talk, I need 6 months to prepare. If I have a weekend, I can do that in a month. And if I have a week to talk about my work, I can do it right now. So all of us are so excited about some of the things that we do, that recognizing the time hack and saying, oh, okay, I'll stop there, because I could go on for days about this very exciting, very important topic. One of the things that you brought up was the idea that folks come to this at different levels in their journey. I use sometimes the leadership journey and experience. We've talked a bit about this, the idea that if you take a fundamental definition of leadership that is influencing attitudes and behaviors to achieve a desired result, there are a million definitions of leadership out there, but fundamentally you're trying to get somebody to do something to forward the mission, patient care, taking that hill, whatever it is. Then one could argue that every doctor does that every day if they're interacting with patients, with teammates, with colleagues. Stop smoking, lose weight. Hey, let's get the clinic moving a little bit more efficiently so patients aren't waiting. All of those things, in your position as a physician, you are engaging from the day you put on the long white coat. And I think that sometimes we use the term physician leader to only refer to folks who have a named title. How does that concept work in with what you do? Can we start training doctors earlier, recognizing that they're influencing behavior to achieve a desired result very, very early on, and give them the opportunity to reflect on that competency and grow from the very beginning of their career instead of thinking, okay, now I'm 15 years in, now I'm going to be a leader?
Well, that's a really insightful question, Leon. And, Richard Bulmer, who's a friend and colleague, has written what he calls small L and big L leaders. Small L leaders being folks who are really doing the work, as we all do as clinicians, when we're rounding with teams or engaging with nursing colleagues, et cetera. And then big L leaders, the people have titles. You're the dean, you're the CEO, you're the chairperson of the department. And the point is that the same competencies that informs one's effectiveness as a small L leader are in fact the same competencies as one uses as big L leader. That things like emotional intelligence and understanding change management and building teams and navigating change are as relevant in making rounds and engaging a team as they are in running an institution, a department, an institute, et cetera. And so they're really no different. And so to that end, to your excellent point, the notion of leadership competencies is heavily embedded in our curricula from the first year of medical school. Lerner College of Medicine students engage in explicit discussions about team building and change management as part of the curriculum. And it's certainly infused heavily in our GME programs, in which we have well more than 200, and in allied health training. And then again, as a separate track focused on leadership in our Mandel Global Leadership and Learning Institute. So at every level of one's evolution through one's career, either as administrative caregiver or as a clinical caregiver at this institution, it's heavily infused with attention to leadership competencies for all the reasons you've stated, because leadership is around affecting change in a constructive, participatory way, invoking the principles of psychological safety. Amy Edmondson's work and others are key to developing effective teams. And high performance in healthcare comes from having effective teams, as you well know.
Absolutely. And I want to get more into your leadership journey, but we have to stop here. Coming up in the second part of my conversation with Dr. James Stoller, the chairman of the Education Institute at the Cleveland Clinic, Jamie talks about how his mindset has evolved as a leader and as a physician.
The traditional question we as all clinicians will ask in taking the chief complaint or history of present illness is, so Mrs. Jones, what brings you to see me today? And instead I've reframed my question in clinic to an appreciative one, which is to say to a patient, so Mrs. Jones, if this visit were successful beyond your wildest dreams, what would we accomplish in our time together?
This has been All Physicians Lead. We can all be better leaders, and our teammates and patients will be the beneficiaries. Go to allphysicianslead.com to unlock your potential, sharpen your impact, and elevate your journey. All Physicians Lead with Dr. Leon Morse is a production of Forbes Books.